I'm going to swap presenter view. Yep. And then I will share my screen, and then that should work, I believe. Okay, so you guys tell me whether or not you can actually see my screen.
Yeah, your slides are there, so you can go.
Great. Well, okay. So first of all, apologize if I do cough once in a while. I have no more mute button right here, but I'll try and do without for the next 45 minutes. Going to talk today about Microsoft 365 Defender, and I will tell you that I will probably call it Microsoft Threat Protection for a couple of times during this session, but you will forgive me that, I hope. Heike, if you do hear me say that, just cover your ears. You never heard it. Entering the new era of cybersecurity. Why the title of the, why this title for a product or a set of products that has been around for a while? It's because from my role within the collective, where we work with a lot of companies that that we try and help to become more secure, we see that there's still a lot of clinging towards the old ways of doing stuff. And the goal of today is to show you how Microsoft 365 Defender and the way it works and the way it kind of pulls things together, brings you into a new era of cybersecurity. It actually helps you become more secure in many, many, many ways. Earlier, there was someone asking some questions about the SOC and which tools to use. As a company who provide SOC services to other companies, yes, we do leverage Azure Sentinel, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the session. But we also leverage Microsoft 365 Defender a lot, like a super lot, right? So this being said, let's set the scene a little bit and talk about the challenges you have in cybersecurity. I apologize for the appalling colors and the slide deck. It's not me who chose the colors. Apparently, this is what happens if you copy paste data into another one's PowerPoint presentation. But basically, we have a bunch of challenges. First of all, cybersecurity, for better and worse, isn't easy, right? There's so many things to deal with, right? There are so many things to keep an eye on, and you've got, you know, the phase where you need to protect your environment. You've got the phase of security operations, which are basically two different things, right? Responding to an incident, knowing how to deal with it, is a different set of skills versus knowing how to protect an environment. And then obviously knowing how to protect a network isn't necessarily the same as protecting endpoints and so forth and so on. So as a result, one of many reports said there will be about 3.5 million unfilled vacancies in cybersecurity alone by 2021. Honestly, I believe it's way more than that, but you know, these are some of the numbers I found. What is even more scary is that it takes about 206 days in average to detect and identify a breach. Now, let that sink in for a second, right? You've got protective tools trying to keep you safe from malicious people entering your environment and stealing data or launching a ransomware attack. And still, with all the technology that is available, in average, it takes 206 days. It's more than half of a year, right? That's a long time for letting attackers be active in your environment before you figured out something's wrong. And even if you do, there is an average of 53 days to contain a breach. Now, obviously, there are some outliers in both ends where you can quickly detect and respond, and there's outliers where you have probably 500 plus days. For the Belgians in the call, you remember a couple years back where there was a breach at our national telco. Was it 500 plus days that someone was active before they saw it? In other words, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but it just highlights the complexity and the vast amount of things that you have to deal with when dealing with cybersecurity in general, right? And then there is the types of attacks, right? There's malicious attacks, 51% account for that. But 24% of data breaches are also caused by human error, which means they're involuntarily. Like you've all heard the stories about the Amazon S3 buckets being on the internet, available, no authentication whatsoever, and data being exposed that way. Well, I'm pretty sure no one actually stood up in the morning and said, you know what, I'm going to remove authentication from that S3 bucket. I'm going to place it on the internet for people to find. Typically, it's an administrator not knowing what they're doing, involuntarily making a change, not realizing they made the change, but in the end result is all the same. You have a potential breach or a way into your environment to do more damage. So these are, some high level, how should I say, challenges that you have to deal with, and where technology can actually bring you some salvation or some help. Now, in addition to all of this, let's take a look at the anatomy of a quote-unquote complex attack. And to be honest, this isn't all too complex. This is quite the normal type of attack, right? On the left-hand side, we've got the attacker, which is going to try to find an avenue to get into your environment. Right? How do they do that? Well, they go and do some recon, just like the military. They go and try and find information about you as an organization. And how do they do that? Well, there's social media. There is, let's say, the administrator of Contoso taking pictures, telling everyone, hey, I'm on vacation in God knows, well, actually, 2020, horrible example. I'm not at work today. I'm here with my family walking outside. So they know he's not at work. He's probably not watching the systems. So that's great information. But to be honest, right, that's not all of it. The worst thing is code. Developers. I love developers to death because they make sure I've got a job. But what happens is they check in code. They post code into GitHub repositories. Maybe they're private, all the better, but maybe they're public because they want to share stuff. We're a community. We're sharing things. Well, what happens if they forgot to remove key material from some code they left behind, which may or may not be a password or a certificate or an API key, which an attacker can then use to get into the environment. So again, there's a multitude of things that you can deal with or that you can be exposed to without even realizing it. And all the same, it's mostly outside of the boundaries of your network, right? But then, right, what's the first thing they do? Well, in the majority of the cases, they'll send you a phishing email. And phishing emails can take 1,000,001 different forms. We're not here to talk about phishing because that would be a session in its own right. But let's just assume for a minute you've got a really well-crafted phishing email. And some of them are really hard to distinguish, not just from a human perspective, but also from a technological perspective. Just the other day, we were dealing with a customer that received a phishing email from a domain name which looked exactly like a legitimate domain name, but the I was swapped for an L. Right? It wasn't caught by any filtering solution because it wasn't the other domain. It was a brand new domain. It has SPF and DKIM. It had everything it needed to have to be a legitimate email. Right? The only thing is an I and an L. Depending on the type of font you're using, it's really hard to distinguish. And guess what? Outlook doesn't make it really simple to distinguish an I from an L. Either way, it was a successful phishing message. And then, right? Well, does it have an attachment? Does it have a link to a website? In this particular case, phishing email had a link to a website. Now, I don't know how you deal with users, or I'm a user myself, and I'm curious by nature. Now, I'm paranoid. Or so those other people tell me. So whenever I get a link that I don't trust, I just take the link, open up my sandbox, and then run it from the sandbox. How many of your users have a sandbox running on their machine and have that same response? Pretty much none of them. The majority does have the same curiosity. So what they will do is just click the link for whatever reason. And then they get to a website, and then all sorts of stuff can happen. Drive-by attack, or the website may prompt you to download a zip file. Well, of course, if I go to a website that I don't know and it immediately asks me to download a zip file, the first thing I will do is download the zip file. Of course, what else would I do? And then what I will do too is open up the zip file and then open up the application in the zip file, because that's just what we need to do, right? It just invites us to do all these things. Well, from there, and maybe some of you are laughing and are like, yeah, right, we're not going to do that. Well, believe me, we've got the metrics running our SOC. People do this all the time, right? Despite the fact that you train them, which is part of what Microsoft 365 can do for you, people will still do dumb stuff. Ultimately, it leads to code running on the device, exploiting a vulnerability, if there is one, but there's always one, and ultimately leads to that device being compromised. And from there, again, 1,000,001 things can happen. They could just, drop ransomware on the machine and you're done. Or, if you're more into a targeted attack or where they want to establish persistence, they will try some evasive techniques in order not to be detected by any of the solutions. Then establish a link with Homebase. In other words, they're going to phone home, and then from there, obviously, they're going to do a lateral movement. They're going to try and move from one device to another, escalate privileges in order to get more privileges in the environment. And if they can, establish dominance in the domain. And once that happens, it's game over. To be honest, it was game over many steps ago. But once someone owns your domain, well, you're in for a big heap of trouble. But what's the goal? Why do people do that? Well, the ones that go to compromising a device, establishing a C2, ultimately they want money, right? Ransomware attack, and they want money from you, or they want your data, or they want both. And believe me, if you are part of a ransomware attack, I'm pretty sure they got your data as well, because ultimately that's what is important to you, and this is what brings value, and it's a business. It's nothing more, nothing less. It's not personal. They didn't wake up in the morning and said, you know what, that guy in Belgium or that person in Germany or whomever it is, I'm going to make their life miserable today. If there is someone who has that mission, then you did something horribly wrong. Either way, what also is interesting to know is that in all of this, right, all these avenues and links that you can have and jumping from one technique to another, it could end up being ransomware attack. It could end up being you being the target. But as we've seen in the past, it could also be that you're just collateral damage to get to someone else's environment, right? And the hard part, apologies, from a blue team perspective is you don't know, right? You have no clue what people are after. You have no clue whether someone is actually going to trigger ransomware, whether it's, a script kiddie trying to do something, whether it's benign, whether it's malicious. And hell, if you're a blue team and you've got a red team, you don't even know if it's an exercise, right? And all of that unknown creates a certain nervous, experience. It creates a lot of difficulty that you somehow have to deal with. Now, when you look at the complexity here, take into account the skills shortage. Take into account the fact that your own team, look at your own team. How many people do you have that have all the skills needed to bring this together and know exactly what they're doing? Well, if you're Microsoft, you have those people, but the majority of the organizations worldwide don't. So in the good old times, what did we do, right? We looked at the problem, we dissect the problem, create different blocks, and then we just go and get the best solution out there. We go and get the best of breed in order to protect us, and then pray that never ever anything bad happens, right? So let's take that approach. Let's dissect our anatomy of our attack and look at what that brings, right? So we've got the initial attack and someone trying to figure out what's happening in our environment, and we also have that connection from a device to the internet, a C2 server. So we've got a really good firewall in place that can take a look at all of that. Okay, so what does a firewall know? Well, it knows the source IP address, it knows destination IP addresses. Based on those IP addresses, it can also kind of deduct where you're going to. Well, that's not a lot, is it, right? Let's say there is an IP address 152.52. whatever it is. Just so happen to have come across some of these IP addresses in recent days. Well, what we've seen is that it was used to deliver a payload onto a machine. So the firewall said, wow, this is really bad, right? You should block this IP address. Well, guess what? It was an IP address on a content delivery network. And if you block that IP address, then there's lots of websites, legitimate ones, business applications that will go down, right? So with lack of visibility comes an increased risk of not knowing what to do with it. Also, you may detect something at the firewall, and you may detect something when it calls home. And what happens in between? Well, you don't know, because that's not your responsibility, because you're not an endpoint protection system, you're not a message hygiene solution, you're basically sitting in several parts of the network, but you don't have that entire view. Well, sure. Okay, so we've got a gap in the, let's take the phishing email attack, right? We've got a gap there. Great. Let's buy the best mail filtering solution out there to ensure that no phishing email ever gets in. Great. Well, there was no 100% protection, referred to the case that I mentioned earlier. So you'll always be open to some attack avenue. Maybe you get less, false positives or actual phishing messages into your mailbox, but in the end, at the end of the day, you will still get some of these messages. So what do you get, right? We can do in some form sender filtering, so you know where it's coming from, the IP addresses, and maybe then if you take the IP address from the message hygiene solution, you can go and talk to your firewall and then try and figure out if the firewall knows that IP address and how many connections have been from that IP address, or how many connections have been established to that IP address. But you need to take the information from the message hygiene solution and then talk to your firewall to actually get that. For the ones that are lucky enough that have a SIM, then you build that SIM, you take information from the firewall, you take information from the message hygiene solution, and then you correlate that information based on use cases that you create yourself. But obviously, the message hygiene solution does more than that. It should give you information about the attachments. Well, depending on the solution you have, does it do detonation? Okay, well, maybe it does. So you've got a really, really good solution, and it protects malicious attachments. But then you've got cases where there is a legitimate looking, or actually a legitimate email with a password protected attachment with a password in the email. Now, all of this reeks of let's not do that. Users will be like, ooh, I've got a little box with a password and I've got the password. Let's see if it fits. And they will take the password, unzip it anyway, and your message filtering solution was ineffective. Well, I can see some people tell me, well, we don't allow any encrypted attachments that we can't open. Well, sure, but I know a lot of organizations that have to, because it's general business practice, and they do get legitimate password protected zip files that can't be scanned and so forth and so on. And despite the big red banners that tell them be careful with this attachment, people will do dumb stuff at the end of the day. And how about phishing links, right? You can click a phishing link, right, and it brings you to a website. And maybe if that website is already known by your firewall, it will prevent you making a connection. But the answer is maybe. What if I know it's a phishing link that is not benign, so it's malicious? I can report it to the IT department, which can then talk to the networking team, who can then block the domain name, provided that we do DNS-based lookups in the firewall. Well, maybe I've got a proxy server that can do all of that. You can see there's a lot of talking around in the environment in order to make that happen. Maybe you can concoct something that does it automatically for you, but it just gives you part of the solution. And as we continue, once we go into the exploitation phase, it's exactly the same, right? You may have state-of-the-art antivirus running, it will never catch everything. You may have, you supposedly have the best EDR in the world, it will not catch everything. Honestly, having been part in blue team exercises before, but also playing around with technology, it is surprisingly easy to bypass different AV and EDR solutions. So if it's surprisingly easy for someone who's a noob at hacking, imagine what a really good hacker can do, right? They can stay relatively undetected based on the payload, right? Eventually, they'll trip a wire, right? They'll do something that correlates something somewhere and raise a flag. But if you only have a great EDR and mediocre network protection, or okay-ish network protection and a good message filtering solution, you still get only part of the story, because how did the payload get there, right? Maybe if you've got a good EDR solution, it'll tell you what the file name was, but then you still have to figure out manually where the file came from. And obviously you can go and talk to the user and ask them, well, did you do something? Believe me, if a blue teamer goes to a user and asks them, did you do something wrong? They will tell you no, because they have no clue. If you then ask them, did you open up attachments? They will start doubting their every word, because they know they're in deep trouble. And they'll be like, I know, maybe, I don't know, you tell me. So it's not very helpful trying to rely on a user when you're just a user, when you're troubleshooting a case or when you're investigating an incident, right? You need more data points. And more importantly, you need the data points across the environment. By now, you have the idea, you know the problem. What I'm trying to point out is that with limited visibility, with limited correlation, you have lots of work. Right? Lots of work means lots of time, means not doing other stuff you should be doing. And every IT person I know complains about not having enough time, not having enough resources. So let alone spend a lot of time trying to figure all these things out. So the problem that you see with these good old times where people go and buy the best they can is, well, they're drowning in signals and alerts. You can have a great firewall that throws 1,000,001 alerts to you, but these alerts by themselves don't mean anything. And if you've got lots of alerts in one area of protection and lots of alerts in another area of protection, and yet another lots of alerts and signals from another tool in your environment, well, try and connect the dots. If you're really good at hunting, if you're really good at correlating, then great. But there's one thing you should know. People don't scale very well, right? Labor is expensive, and people generally have a tendency not to be able to stretch in 12-hour shifts or 16-hour shifts and have the same focus as they had before, right? So that doesn't really work. Attackers, on the other hand, they have no schedule whatsoever, right? We know all the ones with the hoodie working at night while you're sleeping. Well, it may be a little bit of a how should I say, a funny way of putting things. But truth is, look at the University of Maastricht, I believe it was. They were attacked on December 23rd. You think that wasn't an accident, that it happened on the day before Christmas, 23rd, 24th, depending on which country you're in. But I mean, honestly, they knew people wouldn't be there. They know people wouldn't be responding to alerts, and that's why they triggered it back then. So connecting the dots is a manual labor, and if you're not there, you cannot connect, and therefore you don't really know what's happening. So solution: let's build something ourselves. Let's make sure that we connect all the dots and make sure that everything is correlated. Great. Well, good luck, right? That's not easy. It's not easy at all, especially if you've got vendor A, B, C, and D working for you. Now, I'm not telling you they don't give you adequate protection. They do protect you really well. But as I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity is more than just protection. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So the dawn of a new era, the dawn of just sounded better than talking about a new era, but the new era of cybersecurity, and I believe it's Defender 365. Why is that? Well, look back at the picture we had of a supposedly complex attack, right? Well, obviously we've got Defender for Office 365, which can keep Teams, message, the Teams, email, SharePoint, OneDrive, all of that safe in a protective mode, and it can bring aboard a lot of data, a lot of signals for us to investigate, right? But it has really good protection. May not be the best in the world, although I do believe it is, or it's at least one of the better solutions in the world, but it gives us really good protection. When we talk about what's happening on the endpoint, well, then we've got Defender for Endpoint. In my opinion, best AV, best EDR, best XDR, basically. Well, not XDR, that's Defender 365. Best endpoint protection solution. And it covers a wide variety of stuff, right? We'll talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework, and you'll understand why I believe Defender for Endpoint covers more than the majority of the applications. When we move over to identity, then we've got Defender for Identity for the legacy ones, right? Azure ATP, the old name. And we've got Azure AD for everything that's cloud related, that gives you the adequate protection and is part of the Microsoft ecosystem. And then for anything that's cloud applications, your data, and so forth and so on, we've got Cloud App Security. Now, for those who've been paying attention to all of these applications, know there was a little mistake in the slide, and that mistake is actually the fact that Cloud App Security can also protect applications on the far left, which could help you protect data from being discovered or from being exploited by an attacker. right? So when we say cloud app security, it is all the cloud applications that you connect, ideally through Azure AD, into your environment and protect in that way. So what does M365 or M365 Defender bring you? Well, it brings together all these protective measures, right? They are homed in a single portal and through a set of APIs. They provide coordinated protection. I love that word. Marketing, really great way of putting things. The coordinated protection basically says, I'm going to take into account everything that's happening around me, and I'm going to make an informed decision. When you consider life in general, that's what people do. We make informed decision. And if we don't, usually we make bad decisions. Well, in cybersecurity, you don't want to make bad decisions because they can be quite costly, right? You want to get and gather as much information as you can in order to know what's actually an attack, what's not an attack, so what's benign, and you want to stop the attacks and you don't want to spend time on the benign stuff or the false positives. And the way that you're going to do that is you're going to leverage the best of technology, right? You're going to leverage AI and machine learning. You're going to leverage the best of these applications. You're going to mix in some threat intelligence and additional analytics. And then all of that, right? The coordinated protection, which is basically cross-domain, you're going to combine that and leverage it to be your R2D2 friend that does cybersecurity for you, that understands it, does it way faster than you can do so that you can save time and focus on the things that really matter. Because at the end of the day, every environment is different. Your crown jewels aren't the same crown jewels as someone else's. They are not in the same location, not protected in the same way. So that business logic is something where AI generally has a lot more trouble reasoning over. But that's the beauty of things, right? It's an and story, not an or story. And together you can really save a lot of time, get better visibility, get better detections, and therefore be more secure. So when you take a look at all of that, that is a value proposition, which in my opinion is not to be dismissed. Sure, there's something to be said to have the best of breed in a solution, but bringing and tying everything in together, it's a much more powerful story. And to be honest, right, and may sound a little bit like marketing here, there is very little competitors that have a compelling story that goes as far and as deep into things as Microsoft does, because they have a wide ecosystem. Now, sure, Microsoft doesn't have an on-premises firewall, right? But they do have they do have the Azure firewall, right? So even if there are specific gaps, right, these gaps can be addressed in different ways. And I'll actually talk about those ways at the end of the presentation. Now, I'm notoriously for running over time, and I see I've got 15 minutes left. So please do speak up, because I don't see a chat or any video here. I just see my own slides for whatever reason. So I'll try and speed up and stay on point. So let's take a look at some real-world examples for Microsoft Defender 365. The screenshots I'm going to share with you are anonymized, have been taken from real environments. Some of them are really scary. Others are just, to make a point around that. But before I do, I want to highlight a couple of things here. First of all, some of you may have heard about the NIST cybersecurity framework. It consists of different activities or phases as you please, like identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, which highlight some of the activities that the blue teamers or you as a defender need to do in order to have a high security maturity, but also to have a high degree of safety in your environment. So identify phase means that you're going to look at what the risks are that you're dealing with, that you know what your vulnerabilities are, and that you basically know what you're running into. It's your internal recon. Well, if you take a look at how M365 Defender and its different applications or features within can help you, then you've got Secure Score that gives you, an overview of your environment. It's basically cloud security posture management, which is partially in Secure Score, partially in MCAS, or basically together. You've got threat and vulnerability management, which is crucial. It's like so important. So the thing that Heike was talking about is, in my opinion, one of the best tools in your tool belt in the identify phase. And so once you know what you're dealing with, you know what to protect, then you move over to protecting your assets. And you do that with the protective capabilities in all the products I just mentioned. We've got Defender and next-gen protection, so Defender AV. We've got the EDR solution, although EDR is more on the detection side. But we've got exploit protection, attack surface reduction, which can prevent specific scenarios from unfolding your environment. And then we've got Defender for Office 365, blocking emails before they enter, so they protect your environment. Same with Cloud App Security. As soon as it detects something, it can cut off a session, can prevent downloads, prevent uploads, and so forth and so on. Then we move to the detection phase, right? That's where EDR comes in, where user and entity behavior and analytics comes in, and where you can actually detect things that are happening in your environment. This is also the phase where, as we will talk about later, Azure Sentinel comes into play. So you can see it's very different. And then ultimately, there's a respond phase, which means how can I leverage Defender 365 to respond to threats that I've seen? Threats could be alerts, incidents, breaches, and so forth and so on. So there's automated investigations and self-healing, which means that basically it's doing everything for you and you just have to follow up. There's integrations to build your own automations, Logic Apps, Power Automate, Flow, so that you can trigger activities once you see a specific alert or incident in the environment. And then again, there is with SecureScore, because it allows you to remediate and take action on specific configuration vulnerabilities that you found through your environment. And for what it's worth, that SecureScore bit and piece, it came back a couple of times because it has different hats. But that's one of the single most effective things you can do against the challenge that we saw earlier about misconfigurations, human error, right? Well, wrong configurations or less than ideal configurations should be surfaced by solutions like, for instance, SecureScore. Now, what does that look like, right? Here is an overview of the dashboard, the security center dashboard, where you can see immediately a couple of devices at risk. I get my SecureScore, I get how many users are at risk, and having 1,168 users at risk kind of makes my heart go. But it gives you, that one-stop shop where you can go through. Now, it's not this dashboard that gets me excited. Don't get me wrong. It's just one entry point. It's the dashboard from where you can access everything else. But looking at stuff like SecureScore, you can see immediately the value it drives, right? Whether or not we all agree that turning on real-time protection should give a 1.12% increase in my score, it's something that is rather debatable. And to me, the gamification kind of works. It's more the overview over time, right? How am I doing now versus a month ago? Am I still increasing? Am I improving my score? How am I comparing to other organizations? You can't believe how often C-levels will come down to you and be like, how are we doing? As long as you can show that you're doing better than organizations like yours, typically you're in clear water. This this guy, unfortunately, from where I took the screenshot, they still have a little bit of work to catch up on organizations like theirs. But as you can see, it gives you a lot of information. And then obviously here we have an incident queue. It's not the nicest of incident queues. And what do I mean with that? Well, there is a lot of data in there. Lots of stuff happening in such an environment. And to be honest, these impossible travel activities, they're a thorn in my eye. But despite the fact that they have a high level of false positives, and by false positives, sorry. They have a high level of benign positives, right? I've rarely seen an impossible travel activity that was false. It was an impossible travel activity, but it was triggered because of a benign use case. I'm roaming with my device, for instance, and this one's connected to a mobile network that routes my traffic through Germany for whatever reason, and I'm at home working in Belgium. Well, I'm not doing anything wrong. But from the eye of the beholder, in this case, Defender 365 or Identity Protection, or Azure AD, I should say, it sees a connection from Germany and a couple of minutes later from Belgium. Well, there's no way that I can travel from Germany to Belgium so fast, unless it's digital travel, which just happens because cell phone was connected to one network, my device to another network. And VPNs are notorious triggers for these kinds of alerts. But why did I include this one here? It's these multi-stage incidents involving initial access and execution on one endpoint. Well, if you open up one of these, then you can see the true power of Defender 365. This is really, really great because you can immediately see how an email, right, or an attachment that was opened on a device actually actually triggered in different solutions and was correlated back into a single incident. So now I know it came in via email, that someone opened up the attachment, that the attachment ran a payload. And from within the M365 Security Center, I can get a list of who was the recipient of that email, right? Or whom else got that email. Did other people click on that? And actually, it will bring all that information to you within the incident page, right? You can see that here it was a single device, a single user, a single mailbox. But if multiple users received the same attachment and multiple ones of them actually opened up the attachment, you know immediately. And I didn't even have to correlate stuff. Now, this is a time saver, right? This is a huge, huge time saver. And this is, I believe, the biggest advantage, right, that you have. And it's one that is unparalleled. And from a blue team perspective, I couldn't be more happy with that. No, now, apologies, I said earlier, there's lots of activities that you have to go through as a defender, right? There is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. But let's keep recover out of sight for a second. Well, how do you deal with all of that, right? How do you actually make this manageable? Well, the answer is it depends. I'm a consultant, so you're going to get the consultant's answer. Creating more visibility is really hard. So the messaging that people sometimes have is, we need a SIM. Well, hold your horses. Do you really need a SIM, right? The answer is it depends on what you're trying to protect and what you're trying to achieve. As I said earlier, right, you've had the different features that are part of, or some of the features that are part of Microsoft 365 Defender, and they cover everything from identify, protect, detect, respond. All four phases, or all these four phases of the NIST cybersecurity framework are covered by M365. You could have a low end, and I know, horrible, I didn't say a low end. You could have your entry level SOC just pointed at the M365 Security Center and use that as your tool, because it gives you incidents. It gives you limited forms of dealing with those incidents. And by limited forms, I mean commenting, the case management. Very limited way of doing it, but it's still there, right? It's workable. You can do hunting. Oh, I didn't talk about hunting. Ooh, forgive me, but it's your primary tool to do hunting across all the products that are part of Microsoft 365. So from a tool belt perspective, M365 Defender brings you what you need as a blue teamer, right? Now, it does have one downside. It focuses on Microsoft 365. Well, no wonder, because it's called Microsoft 365 Defender. Will it surface information about your Amazon Web Services? Well, not really, unless you've connected it through Microsoft Cloud App Security, because then MCAS will surface that information into Microsoft 365 Defender. But obviously, there are certain limitations. And this is where we can slip into the area of Azure Sentinel, where we move away from identification and protection and go into the detection and response phase. Now, I sometimes get into an argument, well, if I create an automate or a playbook that triggers based on an alert I get in Azure Sentinel, it protects me. Yes, it protects you, but it doesn't protect you from the attack happening, because you're responding to something that happened already. So you're in the detection phase because you detected it happened, and you're then responding to the alert by triggering an automated response to do something else, which is a protective measure, but it is not in the protection phase, right? Some confusion there. And as you can see here, out of the box, right, Azure Sentinel focuses on detection and response phases, which are entirely post-breach. So for me, it's also a better together story, right? Azure Sentinel can augment what Microsoft 365 Defender does and give you certain response capabilities, but it doesn't replace in any way what Microsoft 365 Defender does. So when you combine all these things together, right, then you get M365 Defender doing all the protective stuff and the whole four phases of for M365, and then in Azure Sentinel, you can add more data sources, you can add more information, you can do manual correlation, right? Build your own use cases. You can bring your own ML model. You can leverage AI. The entity behavioral analytics in Azure Sentinel can actually go and find or go and search for or detect anomalies through the different data sources that you've connected. And then ultimately, as a blue teamer on the far right, you're going to leverage this set of tools where Azure Sentinel may be your initial dashboard, right? Your initial entry point where you as an investigator will see your incidents, where you will do your initial hunting, but that will not prevent you necessarily from still opening up the Microsoft 365 portal and doing your hunting there, or doing some additional correlation there, or trying to get some information through there as well. I believe there was someone who said earlier that, should we as a blue teamer use the M365 portal as well, in addition to Azure Sentinel? I believe that today the answer is yes. Could you build a logic app that actually goes out to the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint APIs, pull in the TVM data and put it into a custom table in Azure Sentinel so that you can build a workbook in Azure Sentinel to give you the same views? Sure. You could do that. If you're really hell-bent on just using a single interface, then absolutely go and build that. The question is, what's the value, right? Is it that bad to, as part of the activities, actually have the TVM dashboard open, which is really neat and is interactive and gives you a lot of capabilities. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of assigning let's send that to the Intune team so they can do stuff, because most organizations that are in that kind of area, they have their own ticketing system to assign tasks to one another. But if you don't, it still offers you a lot of value, right? So for me, it's not, should I do this or do that? It is, what are you most comfortable with? What is your use case? What's your maturity level? And what are you after? And at any given time, it's an end-to-end story where together they're better, independently they're great, right? So with that being said, on the top of the hour, I didn't lose my voice. I probably will in the next 10 to 20 minutes. I do hope that you enjoyed this speedy presentation throughout the new era of cybersecurity, but we're at warp speed anyway. So honestly, it's a topic that we could dive into for many more hours and discuss at length and very deep, because each of the products that we discussed is multiple sessions on its own. You had a 45-minute session on one feature of Defender for Endpoint, right? That's how wide it goes and how deep it can go still. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to leave it open to questions.
So thanks, Michael, for a great session. Your voice is still great, I think, so no worries there. Except that there are some fans of Mr. Robot. There is only one question at the moment in the chat. The other question is already answered by Heike. So thanks, Heike, but she already left, I think. So the question itself is a licensing question. Does Microsoft Defender for Endpoint has a standalone SKU? Can you attach it to all Microsoft 365 SKUs, use it on its own, or are there minimum requirements?
So licensing is a, how should I say, an interesting one. As of April of this year, there is a standalone license which you can purchase as part of CSP and some other forms for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And that's, as far as I understand, unless you do the Windows E5 license, the only way of purchasing the Defender for Endpoint separately. And yes, you can then assign it to, well, it's not really assigning, you just have to make sure that you have the proper amount of licenses, and then you're basically covered from a legal perspective. Again, not the, how should I say, biggest licensing expert, but that's basically what it boils down to. So, and then we still have a non-technical question from our side. Does your wife play the piano or do it yourself? None of us actually plays. I'm trying to play. So ultimately I can do Frère Jacques or stuff like that. And that's pretty much the extent of my abilities.
So combined with the voice, Michael, this is an ideal opportunity to take a shot.
To test it out.
Yeah. Sorry, you're breaking up, Tim. I don't hear you.
So, does anybody else still have a question? You can unmute and ask Michael yourself if you want.
Yes, Michael, thank you for the session. A quick question. You alluded earlier in the chat that there is a separate licensing scheme for servers. I guess it was you in the chat earlier, right? How does that work and how do I purchase that?
For servers, there are different ways of getting a license. Again, not a licensing expert. One of the ways is through Azure Defender, where you actually have the integration or the ability to install Defender and then connect it either directly to your workspace or through Azure Defender into MDATP. And then I do believe there is, just like for the endpoints, I'm not going to call it a standalone license, but it's some sort of standalone license which you can actually leverage, but there is a minimum set of licenses you have to purchase. Again, if you're really looking for sound licensing advice, talk to an LSP because it's not me.
And thank you. I understand it's a difficult topic. Would the reporting and everything from the server side end up in the security center among the client side of the business, or is it a separate thing?
But it really depends on what you want to do. But they end up in the same workspace unless if you go through Defender, you get, so if you go through Azure Defender, you can get your view of your infrastructure and your servers in Azure Defender, which will not include the client view. But ultimately, if you go to the Defender portal and you've connected them there, then you'll have a unified view where all your clients, including your servers, will be.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
So everyone in the chat is saying it was a great session, Michael. So does anyone still have a question?
Right.
Okay. Good.
Great stuff. Thanks.
Great stuff, Michael. Thanks. If there are no further questions, I think we are through our entire program for tonight. We had 4 fantastic speakers, so thank you for all who took the stage tonight. And of course, also a big thanks to our attendees. With that being said, we are entering our slot for the social bring your own beer. So if you still want to hang out for an informal chat, go grab a drink and then hang out with whoever wants to stay for a few more minutes. Thank you and hope to see you at our next event in December.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all.
Time for some rum.
That's quite quickly after the session.
I'm not giving up yet on the idea of Michael playing on the piano next to the Christmas. I don't know, Jingle Bells or maybe a request song or.
Nope,
Yeah.
none of that. None of that. You'll have to
Maybe
wait
a Jack Sparrow.
until I'm actually ready to do that.
Maybe a Jack. Okay, maybe you can do a Jack Sparrow song or something.